The wind carried dust across the dry plains, whispering through the broken fence posts like an old ghost. Once, this land had been full of promise. Acres of waving wheat and grazing cattle that caught the sunlight like coins in a stream. Now it was tired, stripped of color, and so was the young woman who stood at its heart. Clara Hayes wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across her temple. Her hands were blistered from mending fence wire, her dress patched in too many places to count. The heat pressed down like judgment, and yet she kept moving, because stopping meant remembering. Remembering her father's voice, deep and steady, saying, "This land keeps our name alive, Clara. Promise me you'll hold it." She had promised. And she had kept that promise, barely, since the day they buried him beneath the oak tree by the creek 2 years ago. The ranch had been her father's pride. He built it from nothing after the war, shaping dry soil into a living. But after his death, the drought had come, then sickness took most of their cattle, and the debts piled high. The bank didn't care about promises or graves. They wanted payment, and Clara had none. She'd sold nearly everything. The old piano her mother played, the silver candlesticks, even her wedding dress that had never been worn. All she had left were the land, a half-starved horse named Daisy, and the rough little house that creaked like it, too, wanted to give up. That morning, the postman had brought a letter, the kind with heavy ink and no mercy. She had read it on the porch, her fingers trembling. Final notice. Payment must be made within 7 days, or the property will be seized by order of the county bank. 7 days. 7 days to find money she didn't have. 7 days before her father's ranch would no longer bear the Hayes name. She sat on the porch steps, clutching the letter to her chest. A single tear slipped down, catching in the dust on her cheek. Maybe it's time to let go, a quiet voice whispered inside her. But another voice, her father's, rose louder. No, girl. Hayes blood don't run. As evening fell, Clara saddled Daisy and rode the boundary line of the property as she did every night. The sun sank low, spilling golden light over the dying grass. Even now it was beautiful, heartbreakingly so. She stopped by the small hill that overlooked the whole valley. From there she could see the neighboring ranch, vast, green, and alive. The Creed Ranch, Samuel Creed's land. The wealthiest man for miles and in the most private. Clara had seen him only twice at town gatherings, tall, quiet, eyes like storm clouds. People said he built his fortune alone after tragedy took his family. Some said he had no heart left at all. Her gaze drifted back to her side of the valley. Brown earth, empty corrals, the barn roof half caved in. The contrast hurt. Her fingers tightened around the reins. She didn't want pity, didn't want rescue. She only wanted her father's dream to live. When darkness came, she lit the single lamp by the window and set the letter beside it. The flame wavered, casting her shadow long and thin across the floor. She whispered into the quiet as though the house itself might answer. "Papa, I don't know how to save it." The only reply was the wind pressing against the door, moaning low through the cracks. In that silence, Clara Hayes made a vow. Desperate, trembling, but fierce. She would find a way to keep her home, no matter what it cost, and somewhere across the valley in the big house of Creed Ranch, a man looked out into the same night sky, unaware that their lives were about to collide. Morning came harsh and colorless, with a sky the pale gray of worn tin. Clara was already awake before the rooster crowed, her body sore but her mind too restless for sleep. She poured black coffee into a chipped mug and stepped onto the porch. The horizon stretched out wide and silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. For a brief, foolish moment, she let herself believe the letter had been just a bad dream, that no one was coming to take away her home. Then, from far down the road, she saw the dust trail, a wagon, dark and polished, drawn by 2 gleaming horses. Even before she made out the figure driving it, her stomach turned cold. There was only one man in the county who traveled in a rig like that, Mr. Wilkes, the banker. She set her mug down with shaking hands and wiped them on her apron, trying to look composed. But her heart thudded hard against her ribs as the wheels crunched over the dry earth. Wilkes stepped down, brushing invisible dust from his fine coat. His boots shone like mirrors. His gold watch chain glinted in the sun. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Hayes," he said, tipping his hat just enough to remind her it was courtesy, not respect. "I do wish our meeting were under better circumstances." Clara nodded stiffly. "I received your letter." "Ah." He folded his hands behind his back, looking past her at the sagging barn and the cracked water trough. "Yes, well, the bank's been patient, Miss Hayes, more patient than most would be. But patience runs dry, like your land, I'm afraid." His words cut clean and deliberate, like a knife through linen. Clara bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to let him see how much it hurt. "I just need more time," she said quietly. "The harvest," he laughed under his breath. "Harvest? My dear, this ground couldn't grow weeds if you begged it. I'm afraid time won't change that." He glanced around again like a man inspecting spoiled goods. "You'd be wise to accept the situation with grace. We'll auction the property next week. You'll receive what's left after debts are settled." "What's left?" she asked, though she already knew. He shrugged, his tone airy. "A few dollars, perhaps. Enough for a train ticket east, maybe. You're still young. Start fresh somewhere civilized." Something in her chest snapped at that. Start fresh? As if she could uproot herself from the soil her father was buried in. As if this land was just dirt and fences to her. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "This land's been ours for 3 generations. My father fought to keep it through drought and sickness. I won't let you sell it to the highest bidder like a busted plow." For a moment, Wilkes's eyes narrowed, revealing the man beneath the polished manners. "Sentiment is a poor currency, Miss Hayes," he said coldly. "You have until Friday. After that, it's no longer yours." He tipped his hat again, climbed into his wagon, and snapped the reins. The horses moved, dust rising behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara stood there until they vanished down the road, the silence settling heavy around her. She walked to the oak by the creek, her father's grave marker leaning slightly from the wind, and sank to her knees. "I tried, Papa," she whispered. "I really did." A dry leaf skittered across the ground, and for a moment, she thought she heard his voice again in the wind. "Don't give up yet." "Girl." She rose slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. The sun was high now, burning through the clouds. Across the valley, a dark shape moved along the ridge, a lone rider, tall in the saddle. It was Samuel Creed, watching. And though Clara didn't know it yet, that single glance would change everything. The sun was low when Clara next saw the rider again, closer this time, cutting across the open plain with the steady rhythm of someone who knew every inch of the land. His horse, a powerful black stallion, gleamed like polished coal. The man's silhouette was unmistakable. Samuel Creed, owner of the largest ranch in the valley and the most talked-about man in 3 counties. Clara felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't often that Samuel Creed crossed onto another's property, least of all hers. He wasn't the kind of man who paid social calls or shared idle words. Some said he'd buried his heart along with his wife 5 years ago. Others said he didn't have one to begin with. She watched him approach, unsure whether to run or stand her ground. By the time he reached the porch, she had already drawn herself tall, hands folded to hide their trembling. "Miss Hayes," he greeted, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're on my land," she said simply, though her tone wasn't unkind. Most folks would call that intruding. A faint smile touched his lips, but his eyes, a cold, unreadable gray, stayed fixed on hers. "Then I'll make this quick." He dismounted with practiced ease, the leather creaking softly. "I heard about your trouble with the bank." Her shoulders stiffened. "Word travels fast, doesn't it?" "In a small valley," he said, looking around at the cracked earth and sagging fences. "Everything does." Clara crossed her arms, defensive now. "If you came to make an offer on the land, Mr. Creed, you can save your breath. It's not for sale." Samuel's gaze shifted back to her, steady, weighing. "I didn't come to buy your land," he said quietly. "I came to make sure you're not being run over by men like Wilkes." His tone wasn't pitying. but it carried a kind of restrained concern she hadn't expected. It made her uneasy, like she'd been seen too clearly. "I can handle myself," she said, trying to sound certain. "I always have." "I know," he replied. "That's what worries me." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt heavy, not unfriendly, but charged with something unspoken. He looked past her to the horizon, where the last light of day spilled over her father's fields. "I remember when this place was alive," he said finally. "Your father and we didn't see eye to eye on much, but he was a good man. Worked harder than anyone I knew." Clara softened a little at that. "He respected you," she admitted. "Even if he said you were too proud for your own good." That earned a real smile. Small, fleeting, but real. "He wasn't wrong," Samuel said. "Still isn't?" Then his face grew serious again. "Listen, Miss Hayes, you've got 1 week before that banker takes everything. I could lend you the money, but that'd only bind you to me in another kind of debt. I don't want that for you." "Then what do you want?" she asked, frowning. He hesitated, as if measuring his next words. "I want to help, but not the way most men would. You don't need charity. You need a partner. Someone who'll stand between you and every man looking to carve up your father's legacy." Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what he was suggesting, but the weight in his voice told her it was something that would change everything. Before she could reply, a gust of wind swept through, stirring the dust and the scent of rain. Samuel placed his hat back on his head and nodded once. "Think on it," he said quietly, "because I don't make offers twice." And then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off toward the crimson horizon, leaving Clara standing in the fading light. Heart-pounding, unsure whether the storm she felt coming was from the sky or from him. That night, Clara could not sleep. The echo of Samuel Creed's voice, "You don't need charity, you need a partner," kept circling her thoughts like a hawk that wouldn't land. She sat by the window, the lamp burning low, watching the empty fields bathed in moonlight. Her mind replayed every word he'd said, every glance he'd given. Samuel Creed, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, the man no one dared cross, had ridden onto her dying land and spoken to her not as a beggar but as an equal. But what did he mean by partner? A business arrangement? An alliance? Or something far more binding? By morning, she had no answers, only exhaustion and the sound of a wagon approaching once again. She stepped outside, half expecting the banker's sneer. But instead there was Creed, sitting tall in his saddle, his coat catching the sunlight. "Morning, Miss Hayes," he greeted, his tone formal but soft. "May I come in?" Her instinct was to refuse, but something in his eyes, a quiet resolve, maybe even a trace of nervousness, made her step aside. "All right," she said, "but I haven't much to offer for coffee." "I didn't come for coffee," he said simply. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. Samuel removed his hat and stood by the window, looking out at the parched land as if trying to see its bones. Clara busied herself at the stove just to have something to do with her hands. Finally, he turned to face her. "You've got until Friday," the banker said. She nodded. "Less than that now." He took a slow breath. "Then I'll speak plain, Miss Hayes. I've thought on your situation, and I've come to offer you a way to keep this land." Her heart stopped. "Go on. I'll pay your debts in full," he said. "The land will stay under your name. You won't owe the bank another dime." She stared at him, disbelief flickering into suspicion. "And what would you want in return, Mr. Creed?" He met her gaze squarely. "Your hand in marriage." The words landed like thunder in the quiet room. Clara froze, searching his face for mockery, but there was none. Samuel Creed stood as steady as stone, his eyes serious, his jaw set. You can't be serious," she whispered. "I am." "Why?" she demanded. "You barely know me." "You could have any woman in the county. Why me?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I don't want any woman in the county. I want someone who understands what it means to fight for something that's worth keeping. I see that in you." She turned away, her hands trembling. "This sounds like pity." "No," he said quietly, stepping closer. "It's respect. Maybe more than that." though I won't pretend I know what to call it yet. The air between them felt thick, charged with everything neither dared to say. I'm offering you a bargain, he continued. You keep your land. I keep mine. Together we make something stronger, a union the bank can't touch. Clara's voice came out in a whisper. And if I say no? He nodded once. Then I'll ride away, and you'll never hear another word from me. But you'll lose this place, Clara. You know that. She looked out the window, her father's grave visible in the distance. The weight of generations pressed against her chest. Marriage isn't a business deal, Mr. Creed, she said softly. It's a promise. I know, he replied. That's why I'm asking it of you, and not of anyone else. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Samuel reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table, the bank's exact payment, sealed and ready. Think on it, he said. I'll come back tomorrow for your answer. Then he placed his hat back on his head and left, the door creaking shut behind him. Clara stood alone in the dim light, staring at the envelope as if it were something alive. It glittered faintly in the sunbeam, both salvation and trap. Her heart ached with fear, and something else she didn't dare name. The day after Samuel Creed's proposal, the world seemed to move slower, as if time itself were waiting on Clara's answer. The envelope still lay on the kitchen table where he had left it, its edges curled slightly from the heat. Every time she passed it, she felt its weight, heavier than a stone. She hadn't touched it. Not yet. Outside, the wind had changed. The sky was the color of lead, thick and bruised with storm clouds. The animals were restless, the old mare pawing the dirt, the hens refusing to roost. Clara felt the same unease crawling beneath her skin. She worked the fences until her hands bled, trying to keep her mind busy, but it was no use. Samuel Creed's words wouldn't leave her. You keep your land. I keep mine. Together we make something stronger, marriage. The very idea of it tangled her chest. She'd dreamed once, long ago, of love that came softly, with laughter and letters and promises whispered under starlight. Not this. Not a bargain struck over debt and desperation. And yet, there was something in Samuel's voice that didn't sound like pity. It sounded earnest, heavy with truth. Still, she couldn't trust it. She couldn't trust him. By noon, the storm broke. Lightning cracked open the sky and rain fell in sheets. Clara rushed to pull the laundry from the line, but the wind ripped the cloth from her hands. She stood there in the downpour, soaked to the bone, watching the rain swallow her father's land. The field she had plowed only weeks ago turned to mud in minutes. The roof of the barn, already weakened, gave a long, groaning sigh, then collapsed with a crash that shook the earth. No, she screamed, running toward it. Inside, she found the last of her father's tools ruined, water pouring through the broken boards. The few sacks of feed she'd saved were floating like ghosts in the muck. She sank to her knees in the mud, rain mixing with the tears she hadn't let fall in months. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Everything she had fought for, everything her father had built, was slipping away before her eyes, and for the first time, she felt something inside her break. When the storm finally passed, the land was silent again. Too silent. The creek had risen, flooding part of the corral. Daisy, her old mare, limped from the barn, frightened but alive. Clara led her back to the porch, whispering, "We'll be all right, girl," though her voice was hollow, but deep down, she knew she wasn't all right. That evening, she went inside, peeled off her soaked dress, and lit the small fire in the hearth. The house smelled of damp wood and smoke. She poured herself a cup of cold coffee and sat across from the envelope once more. She thought of her father's words. This land keeps our name alive. And she thought of Samuel Creed, standing in her doorway, offering her something she swore she'd never take. Help. Marriage, she thought bitterly. A deal, not a dream. But then another voice, quieter, braver, whispered from deep within her, what if it could be both? She looked around the house. Every wall, every scar, every splintered beam told the same story, hers and her father's. She couldn't let it end here, swallowed by debt and drought. With trembling hands, she reached for the envelope. The paper felt warm, almost alive. She slid it open and saw the neat handwriting, the bank's seal. Samuel had been telling the truth. The full amount was there. Her decision formed like thunder behind her ribs. She rose, found her father's old coat, and threw it on. The wind outside was still sharp, the road to Creed's ranch half washed away. But she mounted Daisy anyway. As she rode through the wet fields, rain still dripping from the trees, her heart pounded not from fear, but from something fiercer. Determination. She had reached her breaking point, and when she reached Samuel Creed's door, soaked, cold, and trembling, she didn't wait for an invitation. She met his stunned eyes and said, her voice shaking but clear, "I'll marry you." "Mr. Creed, but understand this, I'm not doing it for charity. I'm doing it for this land and for my father's name. Nothing more." Samuel's expression softened, just slightly, and he nodded. "Then we understand each other," he said. But as he looked at her standing there, proud, drenched, and unyielding, something deep in his chest shifted, and though Clara didn't know it yet, this bargain would be the beginning of something far greater than either of them had planned. The rain still fell in thin, silvery streaks when Clara Hayes stood at the wide front doors of Creed Ranch. Her soaked dress clung to her skin, and her hair hung loose and heavy against her shoulders. The moment she said the words, "I'll marry you, Mr. Creed," the air between them had changed. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was something quieter, heavier, like two people standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no turning back. Samuel Creed held her gaze for a long moment, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said softly. The warmth of the house hit her like sunlight. The fire in the great hearth glowed steady, filling the room with the scent of cedar and smoke. It was a rancher's home, solid, masculine, but meticulously kept. No frills, no softness. It felt like him. Samuel handed her a towel and poured a mug of coffee. "You made your choice," he said quietly. "But I need to hear it once more, clear and certain. You understand what this means?" She took the mug in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I understand," she said. "You'll pay off the debt. The ranch stays in my name. In return, we marry." He nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "That's right. But I'll have my own terms," she added quickly, setting the mug down. Her voice grew steadier. "I won't be anyone's charity, Mr. Creed, not yours, not the bank's. This isn't love, it's a bargain. I'll pull my weight, I'll work, and I'll keep my dignity. You'll get no gossip from me and no complaint either." He turned his head then, studying her with a faint flicker of something. Respect, maybe admiration. "You have my word," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give." The silence that followed was strange, not uncomfortable, but thick with an understanding neither could quite name. The rain drummed softly against the windows, filling the space between them. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we'll go into town. The preacher owes me a favor. We'll keep it simple, quiet." She nodded once. "That's how I'd want it." He hesitated before speaking again. "You'll stay here tonight. It's too far to ride back in this weather." Her pride bristled at first. She'd never spent a night under another man's roof. But practicality won. She was exhausted, soaked through, and the road was dangerous in the dark. "All right," she said. "But I'll sleep by the fire." Samuel almost smiled. "Suit yourself." He fetched a blanket from a chest near the stairs and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, rough, warm, steady. And she felt a spark she quickly ignored. When he disappeared upstairs, Clara sat down by the fire, staring into the flames. The warmth seeped into her bones, but her thoughts were restless. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made him. "I'll keep the land, Papa, no matter how." Upstairs, Samuel paced his study, the sound of rain masking his thoughts. He had offered her marriage because it was the only honest way to protect her. At least that's what he told himself. But as he remembered her standing in his doorway, defiant and drenched, he knew the truth ran deeper. He admired her. Wanted to shield her, yes, but not because she was weak. Because she was stronger than most men he knew. When morning came, the storm had cleared. The world smelled of wet earth and renewal. Clara woke stiff but determined. She borrowed a dry dress from one of the housemaids, plain, blue, and neatly pressed, and tied her father's scarf around her neck as if it were armor. Samuel was already waiting outside, the wagon hitched and ready. He helped her up, their hands meeting briefly. Neither spoke on the ride into town. Words weren't needed. The church steeple came into view, and the morning sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the wet fields like gold. By the time they reached the chapel steps, Clara's heart was pounding. She wasn't sure if it was fear or fate. As they stood before the preacher, the silence between them felt like a promise in itself. The wedding took less than 15 minutes. There were no flowers, no family, no music, only the whisper of the preacher's voice, the scrape of boots on the church floor, and the faint scent of rain still clinging to the air. Clara stood beside Samuel Creed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she were bracing for a blow. When the preacher asked if she would take this man as her husband, she hesitated for half a breath, then said, "I will." It was done. The preacher gave them his blessing, and Samuel pressed a plain gold band into her palm. No kiss followed, no tender gesture, just a nod, quiet and respectful, as though they had sealed a business contract instead of a marriage. When they stepped outside, the morning sun had broken through the clouds, lighting the wet streets with a soft golden glow. Samuel helped her into the wagon without a word. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It was cautious. They were strangers now, bound by vows neither had spoken from love. The ride back to Creed Ranch was long. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, the gold band glinting faintly on her finger. It felt heavier than she expected, as though it carried the weight of her father's land and her future. When they reached the ranch, Samuel stopped the wagon and said simply, "Welcome home." The words caught her off guard. Home. It didn't feel like one. The Creed house was enormous, with high-beamed ceilings and dark polished wood. Every corner seemed too grand, too still. Servants moved quietly through the halls, glancing at her with thinly veiled curiosity. A few whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. "The new Mrs. Creed," one murmured. "Didn't think he'd ever marry again?" "Poor thing," another replied. "She looks like she's walked through a storm." They weren't wrong. Samuel showed her to a room on the east side of the house. Not the master bedroom, but a guest chamber overlooking the valley. The bed was too fine for her liking, the linens crisp and white. "This will be yours," he said. "You can make it however you wish," she nodded, unsure what to say. "And you?" "I'll stay in the West Wing," he replied simply. The distance between them was polite but unmistakable. This marriage wasn't built on affection, not yet, only on necessity and mutual respect. And still, a part of her, buried deep, wondered if that could ever change. Days turned into weeks. Clara rose before dawn, helping the housekeeper with chores, feeding the horses, walking the land that now legally belonged to her again. She avoided the main house when she could. Samuel was always there, buried in ledgers or overseeing his ranch hands. When their paths crossed, he was unfailingly courteous, tipping his hat, asking after her health, but never lingering long enough to soften the space between them. At night, she would sit by her window staring across the fields. The land looked different from here, greener, stronger, alive under Creed's care. Sometimes she caught sight of him riding at dusk, silhouetted against the burning sky, and something inside her stirred. Gratitude, maybe. Or loneliness. She couldn't tell. One evening, she found a new pair of gloves neatly folded on her doorstep. Sturdy leather, her size exactly. No note, no words. But she knew who had left them. The next morning, she saw the fence posts along her father's old boundary freshly repaired. Again, no word from Samuel. It was his way of speaking, through actions. not sentiment, and slowly, quietly, something inside her began to thaw. Still, there were moments when the silence between them felt unbearable. Two lives living side by side, touching but never truly meeting. One night, unable to sleep, Clara whispered into the darkness, "What have I done?" But another voice in her heart, steady, unyielding, whispered back, "You've survived, and for now, that was enough." Winter came early that year. The nights turned sharp and restless, and frost laced the windows like white lace. The air in Creed Ranch carried the scent of smoke and cold pine, and though the great house was warm, Clara Hayes Creed felt the chill in her bones. She had been living there for nearly 2 months, yet she still moved through the halls like a visitor. The servants had grown used to her presence, but their eyes still lingered, curious and cautious. Samuel remained as polite and distant as ever. Their exchanges were brief, a nod over breakfast, a quiet good evening in the hallway, an occasional question about the ranch's accounts. It should have been easy to resent him, but Clara couldn't. His silence wasn't cruelty. It was grief. Sometimes she'd catch him standing alone at the edge of the property, staring into the distance where his late wife's grave lay, a small hill beneath a lone willow tree. He never spoke of her, but the sadness in his posture told her everything. He had loved deeply once, and that kind of loss didn't fade. It hardened into armor. One evening, Clara stayed up late mending a torn work shirt by the kitchen fire. The house was quiet, save for the ticking clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. She was nearly finished when the door burst open, slamming against the wall. Samuel staggered inside, his coat soaked with rain, his right arm bleeding from a gash. "Mr. Creed!" she gasped, leaping to her feet. "It's nothing," he muttered, brushing her off. "Horse through me! Damn fence post snapped! You're bleeding!" she said sharply. "Sit down." He opened his mouth to protest, but the command in her voice stopped him. He sank onto the chair, breathing hard, rain dripping from his hair. Clara fetched a basin of warm water, her heart racing as she cleaned the wound. The cut wasn't deep, but it had bled plenty. "You should have called someone," she scolded, pressing a cloth against it. "Didn't want to wake the house," he replied. "Didn't know you'd still be up." Her hands were steady, but her voice softened. "I'm always up late. This house feels too quiet when it sleeps." He glanced at her then, really looked at her. The lamplight caught her face, soft and tired but strong. For the first time, she didn't look like a desperate girl clinging to a ranch. She looked like she belonged there. "Does it feel like home yet?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, wringing out the cloth. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I'm working the land or when the morning light hits the fields. Then I remember why I fought for it." He nodded, gaze lowering to the floor. "Your father would have been proud." That simple kindness struck deeper than she expected. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed to hum softly with something new. Not the stiff formality of before, but a quiet understanding. When she finished bandaging his arm, he flexed his fingers and gave a low chuckle. "You've got a firmer hand than most doctors I've met." "That's because I can't afford to be gentle," she replied, smiling faintly. His eyes softened. "No, I suppose you can't." For a long moment, they just sat there. Two people bound by circumstance, connected by silence. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice almost shy. "You should call me Samuel," he said. "You're my wife, after all." Her breath caught, surprised by the warmth in his tone. "All right." "Samuel." The sound of his name on her lips made something flicker behind his calm exterior. He rose slowly, testing his bandaged arm. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "For everything." When he left the room, she sat back down, staring into the fire. The flame danced low and steady, casting golden light across the walls. For the first time since she'd come to Creed Ranch, the house didn't feel cold, and upstairs, Samuel lay awake longer than usual, thinking not of the woman he had lost, but of the one quietly stitching her way into his life. The days that followed were strangely different. The tension that had once hung between them began to melt like frost under sunlight. Samuel had started taking his breakfast in the kitchen rather than his study, sharing quiet mornings with Clara over black coffee and biscuits. He even asked her once if she'd like to ride out with him to check the north pastures. She had agreed, shyly at first, then with genuine excitement. The ride that morning was beautiful. Mist rose from the grass, catching the early sun like ribbons of gold. Clara's skirts brushed the saddle as her horse trotted beside Samuel's, the two of them moving in easy silence. He looked different when he rode. Free, lighter somehow, as if the land itself lent him peace. "You ride well," he said at one point. "My father taught me before I could walk," she replied, smiling faintly. "I imagine he'd be proud to see you keeping his land alive." Those words, "your land," struck her like a soft blow. For so long she had thought of it as his now, but he still saw it as hers. They stopped near the creek that once marked the border of her family's property. The water ran clear, glittering in the light. Samuel dismounted, tying his reins to a post. Clara followed, watching as he crouched near the edge and picked up a smooth stone. "I meant to tell you something," he said quietly. "It's about your father." Her heart gave a nervous flutter. "My father?" He nodded slowly. "Before he died, he came to me, offered to sell me part of his land. He was sick then, though he tried to hide it. Said he wanted to make sure you wouldn't lose everything if things went bad." Clara's lips parted. He came to you?" Samuel's eyes softened. "He asked me to keep an eye on you if anything ever happened. Said you had his spirit, stubborn, proud, and kind." She felt the world tilt a little. "You knew?" "All this time?" He nodded. "I tried to stay out of your affairs after he passed. Thought you'd want your independence. But when I heard the bank was moving in, I couldn't stand by." Clara's throat tightened. The truth settled over her like a heavy, tender weight. All this time, she had thought Samuel's offer of marriage was pure business, a practical arrangement to save her home. But now she realized there had been more to it, a promise made long before desperation forced her hand. She turned away, blinking back tears. "You could have told me," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "But you'd have refused my help." "You're too proud, just like your father." She gave a shaky laugh despite the sting in her chest. "He always said that pride would be the death of me." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air. "It's what makes you strong," he murmured. "You've built this place back up piece by piece. You didn't marry me to be saved, Clara. You saved yourself. I just stood beside you." Her eyes lifted to meet his. For the first time since they had married, she saw the truth not just in his words but in his face. The quiet respect, the affection he had never spoken aloud, the promise that had been there all along. A breeze swept through the valley, tugging gently at her hair. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him how much his honesty meant. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said at last, "for keeping your word." He covered her hand with his own. "Always." And in that simple touch, something unspoken passed between them. Not duty, not obligation, but something deeper. Something real. When they rode back to the ranch, the land seemed brighter, the air clearer. The distance between them was gone, replaced by quiet understanding, the kind that only truth could build. Neither said the words yet, but both of them knew. What had begun as a bargain was slowly turning into a bond that neither had expected, and both were starting to need. Spring arrived softly on the Creed Ranch. The air grew warmer. The earth turned green again, and wildflowers spread across the hills like scattered paint. After a long winter of quiet understanding, something had shifted between Clara and Samuel, subtle but unmistakable. The distance that once filled their house was gone. Now, laughter drifted from the kitchen, soft conversation filled the evenings, and sometimes, when no one was watching, Samuel's hand would brush hers as they passed. It wasn't sudden love. It was the kind that grew slowly, like roots spreading beneath the soil, strong and unseen. One morning, Clara stood by the corral watching a new foal stumble to its feet. The little thing was shaky, all legs and nerves, but determined. She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, unaware that Samuel was watching her from the fence. "You've got a knack for calming them," he said, walking over. She turned, smiling faintly. "Patience helps. They just need to know they're safe." He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his shoulder. "Seems you've done the same for this place," he said. "And for me." She looked up at him, surprised. His tone wasn't teasing. It was soft, almost reverent. "I wasn't sure I could belong here," she admitted. "At first I thought this house would always feel like yours." "And now?" he asked. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Now it feels like ours." Samuel smiled, a real smile, unguarded and full of light. "That's all I ever wanted." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun warmed their faces, the wind carried the scent of hay and blossoms, and everything around them felt alive. But even in peace, Clara's heart was restless. She had grown so used to fighting, to surviving, that she didn't quite know how to simply be happy. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, she finally said what had been heavy on her mind. "Samuel," she began, her hands folded in her lap, "when we married, it wasn't for love. I want to be honest about that." He turned toward her, calm as ever. "I know, but it's changed," she continued softly. "You've changed. Or maybe I have. I can't tell anymore." He reached over, covering her hands with his. His touch was gentle, steady, the kind that quieted storms. "You don't owe me love, Clara. You never did. What we have now, that's enough for me." She looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who had once been a stranger but had become her strength, her quiet, her home. And suddenly all the walls inside her heart, the fear, the pride, the caution, began to crumble. Tears stung her eyes as she whispered, "But I do love you." The words came out trembling, but true. Samuel's breath caught. For the first time since his first wife's passing, he let himself feel something he had long buried. Hope. He lifted her chin gently, his voice hushed. "Say it again," she smiled through tears. "I love you, Samuel Creed." And when he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, like everything about him. A promise kept, a new beginning. From that day on, the ranch felt different. The rooms that once echoed with silence now carried warmth and life. Clara planted flowers along the porch. Samuel built her a small writing desk by the window, and together, they began to plan a future not built on necessity but choice. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Clara would think back to the girl who once stood on her porch, facing the loss of everything she owned. She smiled at the memory, whispering to herself, "I thought I was losing my home that day. I didn't know I was finding my heart." And beside her, Samuel would take her hand, silent as always, but his thumb tracing gentle circles over her ring finger said all that needed saying. Their story hadn't begun with love, but it had ended exactly where it was meant to, in it.